Hello and welcome to the Fit to Transform podcast, where you learn how to train and diet effectively and, most importantly, how to maintain those results for life, once and for all. I'm Nikias Tomasiello, a transgender training and nutrition coach working online with anyone who's ready for a true lifestyle transformation, anywhere they may be in the world. As a friendly reminder, any and all information provided is for educational purposes only. You should consult with your doctor before implementing any changes to your diet and exercise program. With that disclaimer out of the way, thank you for being here. Now grab yourself a cup of tea or pre-workouts and enjoy. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Today I have an amazing interview with Dr. Whitney Linsenmeyer on the topic of nutritional considerations for gender diverse people. Dr. Whitney Linsenmeyer is a registered dietitian. She's an assistant professor at St. Louis University in Missouri and a spokesperson for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. One of her research interests is gender diverse health, a topic on which, unfortunately, there is very little research at the moment, which is why I was so keen to get her on the podcast to give an overview of the available evidence as it pertains to nutrition, but also to get more insight into her own experience as a registered dietitian working with gender diverse people. We talked about how hormone replacement therapy can impact the health of a gender diverse person. We discussed whether to use male or female values to calculate your caloric needs and other nutritional needs, depending on the stage of transition that you may be in. If you're not a gender diverse person, this podcast can still be for you because we covered important aspects of nutrition that can apply to absolutely everyone, including heart health and how to promote heart health with nutrition, as well as the principles of healthy eating that apply not only to gender diverse people, but to anyone, regardless of their hormonal situation. So I'm not going to spend any more time introducing her because she does an amazing job of shining on this podcast. So thank you very much for tuning in, and let's get straight to the interview. Hey, Whitney, welcome to the podcast, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
All right, so before I get to the main topic of the conversation, which is going to be nutritional considerations for gender diverse people, I'd like you to introduce yourself to the audience and tell people what you do, who you are, and why you're so awesome at what you do.
Oh, that's very generous of you. My name is Whitney Linsenmeyer. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a dietitian by training. And currently an assistant professor of nutrition and dietetics at St. Louis University, which is in St. Louis, Missouri. And I also serve as a spokesperson for the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, which is our national organization of dietitians in the United States.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. So the way I learned about you was when I came across a paper that you authored alongside another researcher in 2019. It was titled Caring for Transgender Patients and Clients, Nutrition-Related Clinical and Psychosocial Considerations. So that's why I invited you here today. And it was quite interesting to me to realize that that was pretty much the only paper I found on the topic, which is quite telling. So my first question is going to be, why do you think that we need nutritional considerations for gender diverse people? And do we even need them? Or is it just an assumption I am making?
Sure. So I tend to kind of broadly categorize the nutrition related considerations into those more clinical considerations and then the psychosocial nutrition related considerations. So I'll be brief, and if there's things that you want to go into in more depth, certainly ask me. But in general, on the clinical side, there are expected effects with masculinizing or feminizing hormone therapy that are related to nutrition. So things like changes in body weight, body composition, The location of fat tissue throughout the body we expect to change, and things like changes in biochemical values like lipid levels or blood pressure that may change as well. So all things where nutrition can play an important role. On the clinical side, there's also what I describe as like the sex specific parts of a nutrition assessment. So this is any time where like a dietitian working with a trans or gender diverse client would have to select between a male or female reference value. So for example, when we're estimating energy needs and producing a predictive energy equation where we have to select male or female to run that equation. So that's on the kind of the clinical side. And then on the psychosocial side, some of the big buckets are eating disorders is really where we see the greatest amount of research at the intersection of health and nutrition. So a fairly robust and yet still growing body of evidence looking at the prevalence of eating disorders and also the unique causes or the etiology. Also, food insecurity is another one of those bigger buckets, which we see intersecting some of those predictors like homelessness, poverty, or barriers when accessing food assistance programs. And then the third bucket on the psychosocial side, which is something I'm very interested in, is the how a person's relationship to food and nutrition and physical activity can evolve.
Hmm. Very interesting. Thank you for detailing both the clinical and the psychological effects that transition can have and how they interact with food and physical activity. I think while the psychosocial aspects are really valuable, they are also much more understood within by transgender people because we live them. Where there's a lot of talk in transgender and gender diverse communities about the prevalence of eating disorders, food insecurity, and the relationship to food and fitness and how it evolves throughout our transition. There is much less talk and a lot more questions about the clinical changes and how nutrition can help with those or how it can affect those in any way. So I think for this podcast, I'd like to start definitely with the clinical changes. And you mentioned body weight, body composition, the location of fat tissue, changes in lipid levels and blood pressure, and the sex specific part of a nutrition assessment. So I'd say, how about we just take one at a time and reflect on them? What do you think?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, let's start with body weight then, and how hormone replacement therapy can affect it.
Mm-hmm. So do you want just sort of an overview of the existing research and what we expect to see in folks who are on hormone therapy?
Yes, please, that would be great.
Sure.
And if you have any experience as a practitioner as well that you want to talk about, that would be great.
Definitely, yes. So we do expect some weight gain with both masculinizing and feminizing hormone therapy. And it's interesting, there have been a couple of systematic reviews that have tried to estimate, based on research that we have out there, like the total expected weight gain. And from that research, we have they estimate about, excuse me, about 4 pounds of weight gain within the first, years of therapy. And then with masculinizing hormone therapy, we expect to see the increase in lean body mass and the decrease in fat mass. With feminizing hormone therapy, we expect to see the reverse, the increase in fat mass and decrease in lean body mass, and yet a net weight. So that's what research says, but in my clinical practice, I have the privilege of working with folks in an outpatient setting. And I have seen folks reporting up to 60 pounds of weight gain within the first couple of years of initiating hormone therapy. So I think it's kind of important to understand that small number, that 4 pound expected weight gain, might not really reflect the range that we see in reality, in the real world. And when I'm thinking of that patient in particular who I was working with, it was really interesting to me because this is a trans man, and he wanted to have that larger body size. So he gained 60 pounds, but he was like proud of having a larger body, which was really interesting for me because a lot of times my bias as a dietitian is assuming that people don't want to have that weight gain, or if they are at a BMI that we would classify as overweight or obese, that they would want to lose weight. So that's a real like was very, I feel like, transformative for my thinking, to confront that bias and realize that people might actually genuinely desire a larger body size. For this patient in particular, that larger body was really an expression of his masculinity. Like all the men in his family had larger bodies. He described them as like stocky, like big, kind of tough guys. So for him, his larger body was really an expression of his gender identity. So I think that's always important to consider when we're talking about weight gain and changes in body size, is bringing in and making sure we're really focused on like what does that person, that client, that patient want for their body size. Maybe they do want a larger body size. So not assuming that we want to prevent that weight gain or help them to lose weight if they do in fact experience weight gain.
I agree. I hope it comes across that I'm coming to this from a very weight neutral perspective. I want to know what the evidence says and what you find in practice. But I'm not suggesting that somebody should aim to lose that weight. Indeed, what I'm more interested in trying to parse out with your help is, so you're saying both based on the research and based on experience in clinical practice, it seems like there is some amount of weight gain with HRT. Now, what might be the reason for that? You mentioned that it seems to occur with the hormone replacement therapy, but then you also talk about this case study in which the fact that the patient was willing to gain the weight and desired a larger body size might actually point to the fact that in his case, he might have gained quite a bit more weight than 4 pounds because he was making an effort to do so. So, in addition to hormone replacement therapy, is that the only reason why people gain weight? Or, as in, what does it do to the body to make you gain weight, if we're aware? Or how does it change potentially the way we think about food or appetite or hunger or anything like that?
Yeah, so there's definitely the direct impact of the hormones on like the muscle tissue or the fat tissue. But
Hmm.
I think what you're getting at is that there's also what I've heard from the folks that I work with, trans men specifically, is the huge increase in appetite that they experience when starting on testosterone.
Hmm.
I think that's something that is not always discussed with their physicians when they're first starting on hormone therapy. Like, hey, this is something to expect. Um, but for most of the folks that I've worked with, they're experiencing this big, huge change in appetite. Um, I think another piece of it too may be patients describing hormone therapy as a second puberty, which we know can come with just all the hormonal changes that are causing physical changes, but also kind of that emotional piece too, and just a rapid time of change in the body overall. So sometimes food can just be you know a comfort um, during that time of rapid change.
Oh, I see. That's actually something I've never considered. Obviously, I experienced the second puberty. I am experiencing it as well. A lot of my clients do. I never thought about it as food could comfort a person through this time of change. I always thought of the increase in hunger as an effect of the second puberty because your body is almost growing again in a way due to the changes in hormones, or at least undergoing changes in hormones that are common when your body was growing up. Now, it might not be changing as much as when you were a teenager, but the changes in hormone are similar to that time, so your body responds with an increase in hunger. Would that be correct?
Yes.
Okay, so it sounds like there's an increase in hunger due to either an increase in fat mass or an increase in muscle mass, depending on whether somebody is male to female or female to male,
Hmm.
and whether the hormone they're taking is estrogen or testosterone. And then there's an increase due to the increase in body weight, normally due to an increase in how much we're eating, and an increase in the calories we're eating specifically,
Hmm.
due to the second puberty and potentially the emotional impact that this second puberty can have.
Hmm.
And then we covered body composition because we did say that this weight gain can be more muscle, usually for transgender men or people on testosterone, and more body fat mass in transgender women. You also mentioned specifically fat tissue location. So that tells me that where that fat is stored changes with hormone therapy as well.
Yes.
And how does that happen? Where does it go?
So with testosterone or masculinizing hormone therapy, we tend to see a greater deposition of fat or location of fat around the midsection.
Mhm.
Tends to be the effect of testosterone therapy, versus feminizing hormone therapy, which tends to promote fat in the hips and the buttocks. I've also that's and those are the main areas, but I've also heard folks just recognize like that their facial, um, kind of just yeah, their the way their face looks may change, and that can be in part due to, often usually it's like the kind of the loss of fat on masculinized hormone therapy, or sometimes a little bit of gain in fat in the facial area on feminizing hormone therapy.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, those are the main areas where we expect to see those changes with the different types of hormone therapy.
That makes sense. Since we're talking about body weight and body composition, I alluded to the topic of calorie balance already. And in my understanding, that is the biggest factor that can change your body size as well as the composition of that body size. So fat mass and muscle mass, in addition to exercise. So exercise, well, calorie balance includes exercise and diet as its two main components. So maybe we can draw a line to the final topic that you had mentioned within the clinical change list that we made earlier, and it was the sex specific part of a nutrition assessment. Now, 100% of my gender diverse clients will come to me asking me if I want to use a nutritional calculator to figure out my calories to maintain my weight, for example. What am I supposed to pick? So I pose the question now to you. What do dietitians generally do utilizing the available evidence when faced with this dilemma?
Sure. And that's interesting to know that you hear it from your clients as well, because that's probably the number one question that I get from dietitians in the United States is like, how do I calculate calories? Like, I always kind of describe it as like, I feel like dietitians treat it as a vital sign. Like we like have to do it. Otherwise we feel like we, are missing a piece of the client's information.
Hmm.
Um, so I recommend three different strategies
Mm.
for choosing which value to use when we're confronted with, a sex specific question like calculating calories. Um, the first strategy being if there is a client who is not medically transitioning, so perhaps a person who um, is has not yet started on hormone therapy, or just identifies as trans or non-binary, but doesn't want to be on hormone therapy. Um, that we use the values that are consistent with sex assigned at birth, and um, and sometimes that gives people pause, like that we're not honoring their gender identity, which I totally understand that kind of like hesitation with that strategy. My my stance with that is that we have a duty to we want to do the most accurate estimate possible, and that we can honor a person's gender identity in other ways, right? Like by using their correct name and pronouns, for example.
Hmm.
But if for anyone who isn't on hormone therapy, or for perhaps an adolescent who was only on puberty blockers, using the sex assigned at birth will provide the most accurate estimate, right?
Yes.
So that's the first strategy that I use. The second one being to tailor the which value we elect to use based on the stage of medical treatment. We know from, I'm sure you're familiar with the WPATH, the World Professional Association for Trans Health,
Yes.
their standards of care. We have a pretty good understanding of when we expect to see those physical changes, like the expected onset of like the weight gain or the changes in body composition, and then the maximum effect.
Mm.
Uh, so, for example, I'm going to look at the WPATH guidelines here just to give us a good concrete example. So, for example, we expect to see the expected onset of the body fat redistribution starting at 3 to 6 months after initiating hormone therapy, and then the expected maximum effect, like when it's kind of peaking, at 2 to 5 years.
I see.
Like a general reference point, and then be able to tailor, kind of individualize which our assessment for that particular client at based on the stage of their transition.
Mm.
So maybe you're working with somebody who's been on hormone therapy for 20 years and they've been through all these changes. We're not expecting to see any new dramatic changes. So in that case, I think it would make absolute sense to use the values that are consistent with their gender identity.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Maybe they are 1 week into hormone therapy and they've just started um, to not even yet experience most of these changes. Maybe then it makes more sense because they're so early on, to use the values consistent with sex assigned at birth. So basically, the strategy is to individualize the nutrition assessment to where the client is in their medical transition. And I
Okay.
think this is especially important for, I don't know if you've worked in your practice with folks who are seeking a moderate to lower dose of hormone therapy.
Yes.
So we would expect them to fall within those ranges of the male female preference norms. So that's, I
Okay.
think, another common case where we have to individualize it to the clients. And then the third strategy is to use a range of the male female reference values. And honestly, this is the strategy that I tend to use with calories, because if we run those predictive energy equations, let's say we run it twice and we keep everything else the same, age, height, current weight, and we just change out male or female in that equation, it's only going to be a difference of like a couple hundred calories. And honestly, we are routinely recommending calories as a range anyway, right? We might say like 2,000 to 2,200 calories for this particular, patient. So to me, that's just a logical approach to use a range of the male female reference values for something like calories.
That makes a lot of sense. I have a question on the second strategy. So you've mentioned if somebody is really early in their medical transition, would make sense to probably still use the reference value for their sex assigned at birth. Whereas if somebody has been transitioning for 20 years medically, then switching to the gender that they identify with would make more sense. Now, those are two extreme cases, but there are a lot of people that are somewhere in the middle. So based on the WPATH expectations that you mentioned, that the fact that the onset of fat redistribution tends to happen around 3 to 6 months after HRT, would that mean that somebody who's at the, for example, 6 month mark of transitioning using testosterone might want to start using the values for their gender that they identify with, or should they wait longer? What are your thoughts on that for the people in the middle range?
Sure, absolutely. And you're right, those are like two extreme examples, right? But like most folks are that you're probably working with are, kind of in the mid range there. So
Yes.
yeah, because of that kind of expected onset with the body fat redistribution and increase in muscle mass and strength at around 6 months, yes, that's when I would recommend um, switching from the biological sex reference values to those that are consistent with gender identity. Um, and that's really the case for when we're talking specifically about estimating energy needs.
Hmm.
But I'm also thinking of like other reference values. So things like hemoglobin and hematocrit when we're looking at a client's iron status. And those are two examples of values that have um, different interpretation ranges for males or females.
Hmm.
So for a when choosing, which reference value do we use in that particular case, that's where I look to. I don't know if you're familiar with the University of California, San Francisco guidelines.
No, I am not. Can you tell me more about those?
Sure. So these, I tend to, yeah, WPATH are the world guidelines. University of California's San Francisco guidelines. These are more so geared towards primary care settings versus the WPATH guidelines that are broader. But I find them especially helpful because they do have specific recommendations for interpreting certain lab values like hemoglobin and hematocrit um, based on, in this particular case, whether a person is menstruating or not.
Mm.
So that's just, we've been kind of talking about calories, and this is just another example where we do want to individualize it, but we're looking at other clinical factors other than just like the changes in body composition and body weight.
That's really valuable because so often in both the UK and in America, as that's where most of my clients are based. In the UK, GPs, so medical doctors, will use reference values, but usually once you start HRT, they will switch almost immediately to the values for the gender that you identify with. And so it sounds like this isn't necessarily the best course of action from the outset. And having these resources that you just mentioned, so the WPATH resource that I will put into the show notes and the University of California San Francisco guidelines, which I'll also link in the show notes, is going to be really valuable for any listener who's gender diverse who might say, well, I'm not necessarily so far into my transition that I'm comfortable with switching to those values of my gender that I identify with. So I could go to my doctor and present these resources to get the help that I need. Would you think that that is a good idea for somebody who wants to advocate for their own health in this situation?
I do, and I understand that there's kind of there's not a clear cut like super easy answer of like, oh, just automatically switch right at this point in time, right?
Hmm.
So I do think that it takes some individualizing based on the stage of the patient's transition and what like the other factors like menstruation or the sensation of menstruation um, that are important to consider to have the most accurate interpretation. And when we think of something like assessing a patient's iron status, it's pretty important to get that accurate. If not, we might be misdiagnosing them as, having a low iron status when they actually don't, or vice versa, right? So
Hmm.
it potentially lead to a misdiagnosis and then use of like medications or iron supplements when they're not necessary, just as an example of like, you know, what are the potential effects if we don't have an accurate assessment, right? So yeah, I think it's definitely important to make sure that we're you know, doing that as accurately as possible.
Thank you for that. That is a really great insight that I hadn't thought of. I hadn't thought of how things like your iron status that you just mentioned could be affected, but it's extremely interesting for because, as I said, the state of trans health. Well, or rather, the understanding that medical practitioners have of trans health isn't always the best. So, I do want to provide tools for people to be able to advocate for their own health if they don't have a GP, for example, who knows enough about it. So thank you for those resources.
Absolutely.
Now, speaking of other metrics other than energy needs. We also mentioned lipid levels and blood pressure. And what do we know about those values? How can they be changed by HRT?
Sure. So, in general, we do expect to see changes in lipid levels. And when I say lipid levels, I'm talking about HDL cholesterol,
Hmm.
LDL cholesterol, and also triglycerides as being the main ones. With masculinizing hormone therapy, we expect to see a decrease in the HDL cholesterol, which is the good cholesterol,
Hmm.
and an increase in the LDL cholesterol, the bad cholesterol. It's a little more complex with feminizing hormone therapy. It tends to vary based on the route of administration of the hormone therapy, like if it's oral or patch or injections. Um, but that's what we expect to see, and I feel like most of the attention and discussion has been on that the HDL and LDL for folks on masculinizing hormone therapy because
Hmm.
we see those two um, cholesterol types kind of moving in an undesirable direction, right?
Mm.
Now, interestingly, my understanding of the current research is that yes, we do see these undesirable effects in lipid levels, and yet we don't necessarily see an increase in cardiovascular risk when we
Mm.
look at longer, longitudinal, longer term studies. So that's important because that's why we care about those lipid levels in the first place, right? Because we're expecting that they predict, you know, cardiovascular disease risk. But if it's not necessarily significant enough that it's translating into disease, then that's the most important piece, right? Is what's kind of the longer term outcome here.
Mm.
And for me, from as a perspective as a dietitian, I'm thinking my question when I look at that research and what we expect to see with cholesterol levels is, hey, we know that we use medical nutrition therapy like heart healthy diets, the Mediterranean diets um, to help with those parameters like all the time with any patient that might be interested in heart health. So my question is could we if a person who is, let's say, starting on masculinizing hormone therapy and they start on a Mediterranean diet, could we potentially mitigate those expected changes in lipid levels through nutrition? That's my question. I'll tell you right now, there's no study that has been done to actually test that hypothesis, but I hope that we kind of see research moving in that direction in the future.
That's very interesting. So, actually, my next question was going to be, is there any nutritional change we can make to potentially mitigate these changes? But then you went on to say that obviously we care about the changes because of the potential risk to our cardiovascular health, and we don't know that there is an increased risk. So then my question changes to, or rather it becomes a comment, and it's so perhaps it's something that we can observe but we don't necessarily need to act upon
Mhm.
as far as the research suggests so far. Would that be a correct interpretation of what you said?
Yes, I think that's a great way to think about it is, as far as we know from the current research, we expect to see these changes in lipids. We don't yet have sufficient evidence that it actually translates to disease risk, an increase in disease risk. So therefore, we wouldn't want to is it necessary to spend energy and time to change or try and change those lipid levels through diets? Yeah. Go ahead.
If some, I was just thinking about what you were saying earlier. We were talking about how the change in weight is not necessarily something that we want to stop or mitigate. It's something that will depend on the client's health status, and as long as they understand what risk it might pose to their health and they still desire that change, or they desire a different change in body weights, then we try to do as practitioners what the client desires based with their informed consent. Then it might be a similar case here where if the client is aware of these changes in lipid levels and doesn't want to pursue necessarily a change in their diet to mitigate those. Based on the current evidence, we might say, let's not, as you say, let's not waste energy into overhauling your diet for something that we're not sure will actually improve your health just yet. So then my question here would be, if somebody wanted to pursue, they were saying, well, I'd rather be safe than sorry. I am really interested in heart health because there's a history of not so great heart health in my family. What changes to the diet would you recommend to that person?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're totally right the way that you're framing it. I'll also add that when we think about what we recommend as a heart healthy diet or the Mediterranean diet, like it is healthy, it is safe, uh, it's recommended for a number of reasons. So even if you don't have any concern for like, oh, I have a family history of heart disease or something like that, this is a great kind of dietary approach for anybody that wants to eat healthy, right? Um, it's basically a diet very rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, lean protein, um, healthy fats, low in things like added sugars, moderate in alcohol. So honestly, like any of us can follow that diet, and it can be a good thing for a number of reasons. Um, yes, it can mitigate cardiovascular disease risk. It's also just a totally solid and safe eating pattern if you want to just generally eat healthy and take care of your body.
Well, you're preaching to the choir. I'm Italian. In any case, jokes aside, with the Mediterranean diet, just like with most nutritional information, there are a lot, you can Google it, and a lot of websites will come up. Some great, some not so great. Do you have a specific resource that you would point people to if they wanted to read more trustworthy information on this type of diet?
Sure. So, actually, the Harvard Health has published quite a bit on the Mediterranean diet in particular,
Mm.
and they tend to be very like consumer friendly, and their information is free and easy to access. So I like to go to their website. Um, yeah.
Perfect. I'll link that in the show notes as well. There will be a wealth of resources for the listeners at the end of this in the notes of this episode. So thank you for that. Now, the last components that we were talking about was blood pressure. So what kind of effects do we see from, created or triggered by HRT potentially on blood pressure?
Yeah. So with masculinizing hormone therapy, we generally see an increase in blood pressure. And then again, same story as the lipids with feminizing hormone therapy, it varies depending on that route of administration. Uh,
Mm.
so that's another, blood pressure is another area where if that's something that is of concern for folks, or like you said, they just like want to be safe and want to be kind of proactive, that the Mediterranean diet, or healthy diet, is going to serve that same purpose. It's going to be perfectly healthy and might even help to mitigate that expected increase in blood pressure.
Okay, perfect. So in both cases, if we want to be safe rather than sorry with blood pressure and lipid levels, then we're talking about the Mediterranean diet here. It would be the best option.
Yes. And if I can go on a tiny tangent,
Go ahead, please.
so we have the Mediterranean diet. We've got, very sound and frankly pretty similar diets. So I don't want folks to hear that like, oh, this is the only, type of recommendations that I should be looking at. The other ones that I think of as totally sound, are you familiar with the DASH diet?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So it stands for Dietary Approaches to Stopping Hypertension,
Hmm.
and it's been very well studied. Honestly, it's pretty stinking similar to the Mediterranean diet. It's going to be high in vegetables and fruits, whole grains, lean protein, low in sugar, moderate in alcohol. It's not wildly different. Same goes for in the United States, we have the dietary guidelines for Americans, which are just like general healthy eating recommendations.
Hmm.
Um, and they're kind of it's pretty much very similar, right? Maybe the DASH diet recommends a little bit higher servings of fruit and vegetables per day, or recommends a little bit lower sodium. But in general, these are all pretty similar. The DASH diet, the Mediterranean diet, the dietary guidelines for Americans. Um, so I hope folks hear that there's kind of different spins on the same general principles here.
Mm. Okay, so the general principles then, just to make sure that we list them all, rather than just listing various types of diets and assuming that people will know what these general principles would be. Let's talk about what are these general principles that you would recommend for people, and also can we clarify if that's of particular special benefits to gender diverse people, or whether that can apply to anyone? Because something that's quite close to my heart is also to clarify the differences and if there are any differences, because I feel, at least personally, that sometimes I'm the fact that I'm transgender might make me an alien compared to a human who is
Mm.
transgender, but that's not always the case. In many cases, in at least in my experience, the principles of training and nutrition that work for cisgender folks work for diverse folks. So I just want to make sure that that clarification comes through in this podcast.
Yes, I feel that, and why it's close to your heart. I That makes total sense. My my experience is that yes, the recommendations, these are for all humans, right? Human bodies. This is how we can follow a healthy eating pattern. And I wonder if you agree. My experience is that my trans clients just want to know that like this information is for them. Like
Yeah.
might just need to have the language like directed towards them and say like this is for you, this is a great strategy for you, because they might they just they want, I think, acknowledgement that their bodies are going through something spectacular and different, and these recommendations, these healthy eating recommendations, are a great fit for you. Like I think that's my feeling. I don't know what your experience has been like with that.
Actually, I think you worded what I wanted to say a lot better than I intended to say it. I kind of stumbled over my words, but essentially that's what I'm saying. I do think that what I'm going through is extraordinary, not as in fantastic, but as in very different from the standard experience.
Mhm.
And but at the same time, so I want acknowledgement of that, and I want to make sure that what I'm feeding my body is right for the changes that my body is going through. But I also don't want to be scared into thinking that I have to take an approach that's completely different
Mhm.
when in fact it might not be. Does that make more sense now?
Yes, yes, absolutely. That makes total sense.
So then what you're saying is we're acknowledging that transgender people are undergoing an extraordinary life experience if they do choose to medically transition, but these principles of nutrition are still very much valid for them, and they don't need to worry about them not potentially not applying simply because people haven't thought of including them.
100%. Yes.
Okay.
I'm happy to send you two if you're welcome to take a look. Just to kind of exemplify this, I have some handouts that I created, basically just like nutrition that I use like one on one when I'm working with folks on healthy eating. And I mean, at the top, I just say like it's nutrition guidance for trans and gender diverse people. But the actual recommendations, these are the same recommendations that I would be using with any patient, right? Um, it just like acknowledges in there some languages about like, you know, hey, you may be experiencing this if you're on hormone therapy, or like this is common. And also, here's healthy eating. So yeah,
That
it's
would be
refreshing
amazing.
to, yeah, absolutely.
If you are happy for me to also share them in the show notes so anybody could take a look at them, is that all right?
Absolutely. Yeah, they're free to download. and share and print as in whatever way they can be helpful.
That would be absolutely fantastic to have some solid evidence-based information with gender inclusive language so that everybody's on the same page, pun intended.
Yeah.
But now I have danced around the subject a little bit. Now, getting back to the initial question, what are these basic principles of a healthy diet that can support anyone, including gender diverse people?
Yes. So we recommend a diet rich in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, lean protein, healthy fats, and then low in added sugars,
Mm,
lower in sodium. And if you do drink alcohol, to drink in moderation.
okay. I have a couple of questions because I
Mhm.
am sure that nobody on this podcast is going to listen and go, "Oh my God, I've never heard of this before.
Yeah,
It's
right?
earth-shattering." But
Right.
I find that we often throw around some of these terms, but it's not widely understood what they mean, and so people get confused, and they might buy into some misinformation and fear mongering that wanders the internet.
Mhm.
So when we say healthy fats, what do we mean by that?
Sure. So we're referring to mostly unsaturated fats versus saturated or trans fats. And when we think about like actual foods, basically we're talking about like um, oils. So like olive oil, canola oil, safflower oil, any of the, cooking oils. And then foods like avocados, nuts, olives will all be rich in those healthy fats.
Mhm,
Um, versus the less healthy, the saturated fats, which we'll see in like fattier, like red meat, um, or a lot of times in like butter will be higher in saturated fat. Although I love butter, and I don't want I don't want people to be thinking that they shouldn't use butter, but
mhm.
just less of the foods rich in those saturated fats.
Okay, thank you for explaining that. So when you say I love butter, I don't want people
Mhm.
to become afraid of it.
Yeah.
I think it's important to clarify that we're saying lower in saturated fat, but not devoid of saturated fat. Is that right?
100%, yes. And I feel the same way. I feel very strongly. You said what's close to your heart. I feel strongly in that way about like added sugars.
Mhm,
Um, I love dessert. Like I eat dessert every day, and I so appreciate the artistry of like baking and pastry and confections and all of it. Um, I think a lot of times people are like, "Oh, I have to cut out sweets entirely from my diet because, like, there's so much, like you said, fear mongering about added sugars." The issue with sugars is like they sneak into all sorts of, more processed foods where we don't normally expect to see them. And because of that, most people consume too much. Like
mhm.
that is the reality. And we can be conscious of those and like try and reduce those ones that sneak in. But I also want to recognize that like sweets and added sugars absolutely have a place in a healthy eating pattern. So I think, yeah, like you were saying, butter, saturated fat is one of those. Sugars is another one of those.
I'm glad you brought that up because that was going to be my next question. So when we're talking about added sugars, I'm sure you're familiar with some of the trends in the nutrition space online where some people are saying that fruit is bad for you.
Mm.
So I was going to ask, so what do we mean by added sugar exactly?
Sure. So when we're talking about added sugars, we're talking about any sugar that is added for sweetening purposes. So not the naturally occurring sugars that are in fruit or in dairy.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we don't need to worry about having a diet that's low in fruit essentially or dairy.
Enjoy the fruits and enjoy the dairy. Yes, absolutely. And what's unique about what's in the example of fruits is they're also super rich in fiber. So in terms of how the sugar content of that piece of fruit, the orange, let's say, is going to get digested, absorbed, metabolized, it's going to look very different if
Mhm.
we're eating that orange that has, yes, naturally occurring sugar, and it's also very rich in fiber, it's going to look totally different compared to like, drinking an orange soda, for example.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think the other part to what you were saying is that often these guidelines suggest a diet low in added sugar, lower in sodium. So I think an important part of the conversation that isn't often mentioned is lower compared to what? Because that's what trips people up, because then people
Mhm.
might think, oh, then I must have no added sugars and no sodium, whereas perhaps they actually need more sodium than the average person, for example, if they're an athlete that trains really often.
Sure.
So can you clarify, when we're suggesting lower in a diet lower in a particular nutrient or a particular food group, what's
Mhm.
the comparison that we're drawing here?
Yeah, great question and great point about, we're kind of making generalizations here that might not apply to all people if they have like unique needs, like if they're, an athlete who trains heavily. That's a great point. Um, so I can reference, again, these are the dietary guidelines for Americans that
Hmm.
I usually reference. I realize you're coming from the UK, so I'm certain you all have your own version of this in the UK. But our guidelines recommend less than 10% of your total calorie intake or your energy needs coming from added sugars. And then for the sodium piece, it's less than 20, oh gosh, 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day, which is like about a
Hmm.
teaspoon if we're like actually measuring out salt.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's a matter of what's important here is not to take these generalizations, just to apply them with no consideration to what you're already doing. It's a matter of first find out what you're doing. And normally, what I recommend my clients is some form of food tracking. So we find out what their habits currently are. And then we compare them with evidence based principles of healthy eating, and we make changes based on what they're already doing rather than trying to start with the template for the perfect diets and they need to scramble to make their diet suddenly look exactly like that template when that template is simply a generalization and it might not apply to them 100%. Is that what you're saying?
100%, yes. And those guidelines, they're written for the general population and they're reacting to research that shows that like most people consume excess levels of added sugars and sodium, right? But of course, that does not account for the individual person sitting in front of you. And that's why working with somebody like yourself who can analyze their actual current dietary patterns and then strategize accordingly is essential. So you're doing, that important work of working one-on-one with folks.
Thank you. And thank you for clarifying that. It's very important. As I said, I find it so often that people get confused because they think that the generalizations necessarily apply to them. And if they're not following those exact rules, which are not rules, but they're only guidelines, then they're doing something wrong. And I want to help dispel that myth because I think it causes unnecessary stress when energy, as you were saying before, could be better spent on something else.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, so I want to be very respectful of your time, and I think we covered a lot of ground today. So just to draw a quick summary of what we talked about. We mentioned that the biggest changes that gender diverse people might see in regards to how they should approach their nutrition or in regards to their health, really, and how nutrition might impact it, come from going on hormone therapy, whether that's testosterone or estrogen. And by the way, if I make any mistake in the summary, just feel free to stop me and correct me. And these changes with HRT are primarily related to your body weight. So we normally expect to see some form of body weight gain. We expect to see some form of body composition change. So normally in people going on testosterone, it might be more muscle mass and less body fats. And we might expect to see the opposite happening in people going on estrogen. And this can be caused both by the therapy, but also by changing feelings around the changes that you're experiencing and how those feelings relate to your relationship with food. And it can also be related to an increase in appetite coming from this second puberty stage, in quotes. Then we also see changes in where your body fat is located specifically, and changes in your lipid levels and blood pressure. Although lipid levels and blood pressure, we don't know yet if those changes necessarily imply that your health is also going to be negatively impacted. But if we want to be safer rather than sorry, then a solid diet would be the Mediterranean diet or a variation thereof based on the principles that we listed just a few minutes ago. And when it comes to sex-specific parts of a nutrition assessment, so the question here is, do we use male or female reference values for those? For calorie needs, you mentioned using sex assigned at birth if somebody's not medically transitioning yet, or to tailor the value based on your own stage of medical transition, or finally to use a median value using both ranges of male, using both the male ranges and the female ranges, and finding perhaps the median value between the two. And then for other needs other than calorie needs, for example, when assessing your hemoglobin or your iron needs, then a great resource for that is the University of California, San Francisco guidelines that you mentioned earlier. And going to your medical team with those can help them get an idea of which values to look at when assessing your specific situation. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And to finish off, we concluded by essentially stating that it's important to acknowledge that if we are medically transitioning, that is an extraordinary experience that not many people go through. However, the basic principles of healthy eating do still apply, at least to the best of our knowledge right now, to gender diverse people that are transitioning, just as they apply to cisgender people who are not on hormones. Would that be an accurate summary, or have I missed anything?
Yes, I think you did a masterful job of summarizing everything we covered.
Perfect. Now, before we go, where can anybody find out more about you, follow your work? If you have anything that you want to plug, this is your time.
Oh gosh, I'm one of those people who is actually I'm not on any social media. I live in the world of I have like little children right now, and it feels like more work to keep up with social media. So I don't have any. I should have like go to this Instagram or something or handle, but I don't. I'm so sorry. Um, I but I can send you a couple of resources of recent work that I think folks would be interested in learning about. Um, I will say I do have a study coming up that I'm working on right now that is more on the exercise side of things. And basically, I'm looking at um, the experiences of trans and gender diverse folks or athletes specifically in strength sports, and just seeking to magnify their voices. And then we'll use that to create some like handouts, training plans that are specific to trans athletes in strength sports. So we're working through the kind of the university systems right now, the institutional review board approval to make sure that the study is good to go. But then once it's ready, I'd be happy to send you information about that study, that anyone can take a look at those who we're recruiting.
Absolutely. I would love that. I specialize in resistance training and I bodybuild myself. So that would be splendid. You're speaking my language. And that also suggests to me that I need to invite you on for part two, where we could delve a bit more into nutrition for sport and exercise, if you're okay with that.
Can we do that? Because this has been such a great conversation, and I would love a part two. There's like so few people I feel like in the world that want to spend their morning talking about this, so it's been like such a pleasure to be able to go really in depth for an hour. So let's do a part two.
Perfect. So then part two is already in my schedule and I will email you about it. Now, thank you very much for this conversation. Thanks everyone for listening to this interview and I'll speak to you next time. Thank you, Whitney.
Thank you.
And that's a wrap for today's podcast. I hope that you found it as valuable as I did. And if you want any of the resources that Dr. Linsenmeyer mentioned throughout the interview, check out the links in the description of this podcast episode. In that same description, you'll also find a link to an application form to apply for one-on-one coaching with me, your host, as well as a link to my free newsletter, to my Instagram account, and to my website, as per usual. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to the next episode. Lastly, if you want to support the podcast and help me reach more people, please leave a 5-star rating or review on any podcast platform that you're using. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you soon.